Thank you for coming. Austin is an awesome place. It's a gorgeous place you've got here. So, did you guys see that? Okay, that's literally the only animation in my talk, so enjoy it. Okay, so we're going to talk about data validation today, all right? And to take it seriously. I know a lot of, like it's an afterthought a lot of times, and that's not the best attitude to have, okay? So data validation isn't something that people get like excited about, right? But it's a little bit like washing your hands, right? When people leave the bathroom, they need to wash their hands, right? Yeah, nod your heads, yeah. Okay, so it's important. And for our application too, we're on the internet. We have no idea who's shaking our hands, right? These HTTP handshakes, we don't know who's shaking our hands, okay? So this is important. You don't want to get some data pink eye, okay? So I work for WildWorks, and I like this company a lot, actually. I kind of have to say that because they paid for me to come here. But nonetheless, it's a good company. We make video games. We make online video games, okay? Like this one, Animal Jam. This is what I spend almost all of my time working on. And so these GIFs, they pretty well capture what Animal Jam is about, okay? So if you have a pet, you have a dog or something like that, you can put clothes on it, you can put pants on it, but they don't really like that from what I've seen. So if you want to put pants on a cat or a giraffe, come play our game. It's a better way to carry out that dream, okay? So, okay, anyway, the rest of the talk's pretty dry, so we got to start it out right, okay? Let's go over an outline, just what we're going to cover in the talk, okay? So we're going to talk about some attacks. So why is data validation important? I'll just give you a sample of a few attacks, okay? So, and data validation and how that leads to security of your application. We're also going to talk about data normalization, which people don't talk about a lot, and how that can lead to stability, okay? We're going to talk about Joy. This is a data validation. It does some normalization as well. And we'll talk about Tean. This is a library we wrote at WildWorks. And then we'll talk about how to integrate it with Express and Hapi. Okay, these are two really popular web frameworks, so hopefully that'll prove useful. At the end, I'll take some questions. I'll just do it out in the hall because I don't want everyone to get awkward with the silence and everything. But if you ask me a question, you get a free Animal Jam toy. Okay, pretty cool. Okay, I mean, Google's giving out awesome stuff. You can't really compete with that, but okay. Anyway. Okay, so my job is basically to keep kids safe. We have lots of kids playing online, and we want it to be a safe, friendly environment. We don't want anything like, bullying, or worst case is like predation, obviously. But we don't want anything like that happening in our world, okay? Today we're going to talk a little bit about how do we keep our application safe, okay? And so safe from what? So this is where we're going to segue into attacks, okay? Now, this is just the truth. A lot of people just want to watch the world burn, right? If you write, like, did you ever write a choose your own adventure game in C or something when you're learning how to program? And you're like, hey, check this out. And somebody puts invalid input in and then text barfs all over your screen. So there are people just that want to do that. They want to break your application, okay? So if you don't believe me, you can check out this link. Okay, there's a nice list of things that are extremely horrifying and scary. Okay, so at your leisure, read that to your children at night. This is a really common one, okay? So SQL injection, I don't want to spend a lot of time on this, but we just want to insert a user into our database here. You can see on the third line. We just want to insert a user, right? And this is all fine. Well, actually, this isn't fine. If this line of code is in your code base, you're in trouble anyway. But somebody signs up, their name's Paul. That's great. I like that name, okay? But their email happens to be drop table DB user, okay? That's not good. Okay, you've probably seen this joke on XKCD or whatever, but okay. So there's also shell injections. This is really similar. This is where you're gonna contact the shell for some function you need to run. Okay, in our case, we were contacting PHP to run this crypt function, and that's all fine. But then some jerk says his password is rimraf. Okay, so you can see where this is going. Generally speaking, whenever you're like manipulating strings and passing them on to another process, that can be trouble. Okay, now RDOS. Did anyone see the talk this morning by Guy Pudyarny? I hope I'm not butchering his name. Okay, if you didn't see that, that was a really great talk, and you should go back and check that out. He had some really good tips, and this is one thing that he covered is a regex denial of service. Not everyone wants to just burn your data or steal it, right? They might want to take down your service too, and this is one way they can do that. Now this looks pretty innocuous, right? So on the third line here, we're just checking for these trailing semicolons, right? But if somebody passes in this message at the top, you can see, if there happen to be 65,535 semicolons in the string they pass in, which can happen, you run this regex and suddenly it ties everything up for 6 seconds. Okay, that's what it did on my laptop anyway. This is a big deal. This is your event loop is blocked, nothing's coming in. Your application's not responsive at this point, okay? All you did was throw in this little regex and suddenly everything's broken. Okay, and this is a real vulnerability, okay? This was in Tough Cookie. I pulled it from Snick. Snick is awesome. Check them out too. But be careful with your regexes. Okay, so hopefully I've convinced you that the world is a bad place. That was the goal of my talk. Okay. No, come on, that was a pretty funny joke. All right, anyway, so security is important. There's things we need to look out for, and security is important. Those are just 3 sample attacks, okay? So what can we do about it? Validation. So we're going to talk about, here, let me back up. So with validation, we want to make sure that our data looks like what we're expecting, right? A lot of times you just get some JSON or something like that, but we want to make sure it looks right. This is an image from Joy, and I really like that because, I mean, like these little blobs, that is exactly what types in JavaScript look like. They all look like this, okay? But you want to make sure it's the right looking blob, right? And if we do this, then malicious data can't come in, okay? This is really important. This is the first line of defense in our application, okay? I mean, security comes in layers. There's lots of layers of security in your application. Well, I mean, in your network, in your application. But as far as the application code goes, our validation should be the first thing we do, okay? So let's look at some Joy. This is just a simple example of Joy, okay? So we're going to pull it in, and you can see on the third line here, we want to validate this input, seriously a string, okay? We want to make sure that's a string, okay? It seriously might not be. So we pass in our schema as the second, and this just happens to be a Joy object, okay? And then this is really standard. It has a callback with an error and a value. So the error is going to be null because this is a string, and our value is seriously a string. Okay, great. Let's move on. Okay, so let's test a failure scenario. So we pass in 5. Is 5 a string? No. Okay, so we're going to get an error in that case. Okay, but most of the time you're not validating a single value like that, right? You have some schema, okay? So here we define a schema, and the schema has a username and a password. So let's walk through this, though, because this is important how this works. So the username is a string that is also an email, and it has to be a WildWorks email. Okay, so I'm being specific here, and it is a required field. I know this field is going to exist when I'm done validating, or it will be rejected. Okay, so that provides a lot of security and a lot of reliability right there. Okay, I also require a password. The password is a string. It needs to be at least 6 characters long, at most 25 characters long, and it has to be there. Okay, we want to be strict about what we're requiring in our API. Okay, so let's validate it. My username is Paul Milham at WildWorks, and my password is just, I have to go change my password now. Maybe we'll do that later. Okay, anyway, so yeah, this passes. But this is what I want to illustrate with this, is that data validation for Hapi is all in, okay? So that means we validate one thing, you have to validate everything. And this is really important for the security and stability of our application, okay? So we have a username in our schema, and this is the exact same thing as the last slide, just no password, okay? But then I want to validate this object, right? So I have my username and my password, but then I go to validate against the schema now, and we find out Justin Bieber is not allowed, which is exactly what we want, right? So this is important because what if somebody goes in maintenance, they go to update your API route, they add a new parameter or something, and they forget to add the validation, okay? That's a scary thing. That's potentially an attack vector. In this case, it can't happen because it's all in. They're going to go to test the endpoint, it's going to fail, then they'll add the validation, and we're good to go. Okay? So you validate one thing, you have to validate everything. Okay? This means that your developers are not going to forget. They can't forget. And this is really important when it comes to security. You want to force people to pay attention to the validation layer. Okay? So let's talk about normalization a little bit. So Joy calls this conversion, if you look it up on their website. But this is kind of being a good citizen in a way. Let's say that our API is accepting a user ID, okay, and so we want an integer. But somebody calls it and they pass in the string with the number 5 in there, user ID 5, okay? You don't necessarily want to reject it, right, because that's not an integer, okay? So that's a nice thing to do, okay? And so it helps create a contract with your consumer as well, whatever that might be. So they know what they can input, and you know what you're going to get. Even if they send the string 5 in, you know you're going to get an integer 5 after the data is normalized, okay? And it goes deeper than that. We'll get into that later. Okay, so this is why that's important. So let's say we're expecting a number. You can see the second parameter there. We're expecting a number, but then we pass in this string, 1.916. Okay, that doesn't seem like a big deal, but if we didn't normalize the data, here in our second line when we called toFixed, we'd have a crash, okay? And that's stupid. You don't want your application to crash on something like that, right? Okay, so this is a very simple example of why normalization is important. Another form of it is these defaults. Let's say that they don't pass a value. We can supply one for them. Okay? The thing that's cool about this is it allows us to make safe assumptions in our code. I mean, you want to code defensively, but coding defensively is super annoying, right? Okay, now if we have a layer that is ensuring we have certain types on our values, we can make safe assumptions, and we don't have to put like a billion if null checks everywhere, okay? Which is nice. Okay, so Tean is a library that we wrote at WildWorks because we couldn't really find anything at the time that fit our needs. And I'm not telling you to run out and start using Tean in your project. I think it has high-level ideas that are really valuable, and it has some best practices. And what I mean by best practices is practices that I consider best in there. So it's good. So declarative syntax, I think this is great because it's very easy to read. You can just go check it out. They're just plain old JavaScript objects, okay, POJOs. And asynchronous. So this is important because if you want to do any sort of validation that hooks into a database or anything else asynchronously, this is going to be really helpful. Okay, we can convert data into models. So we accept a user ID, we can convert it right into a data model, okay, or user model. Or they could just pass the user's name or something, any unique identifier like that. We can take it, we can map it into a model directly. Okay, it's very strict. Okay, that's where you can find it. And as a note, if you want to stick to Joy, they have custom validators were added recently as well. Okay, so let's just run through this really, really quick because it's kind of the same thing. The parameters are swapped. So the first one is the schema. The second is the value you want to validate. So here we just have an animal, and the animal should be a string. Okay, we have an animal that's a kangaroo. That is a string. Great. Okay, so our callback accepts. It'll has two parameters, and that's isValid and result. Okay, so you're going to say yes or no, did this pass? And the result, if yes, is going to be your normalized data. That's the data you want to use. This is safe data to pass along to your application that you can make assumptions about. Okay, if it's not, it's going to tell you what's wrong. Okay, it'll say, in this case, it's just going to be like animal should be a string. It's not. Okay, but it gets a little more advanced if you have, arrays of objects with nested values. That's really nice for tracking down bugs. But so in this case, let's say the data we pass in is null. So our animal is null. Okay, now we consider that not a string because you can't make safe assumptions about null. Like you'd have to put an if null check on there. It could lead to a crash. Okay, so we reject that value. If you wanted to accept nulls for values, you can do that, but in this case, we didn't want to. So let's look at something a little more strict. Okay, so in our schema here, we're accepting an animal, and it has to be a string, but we only want kangaroos or tigers. Okay, this is Animal Jam, so only kangaroos or tigers. Okay, and sparkles, because you always want your animal to sparkle. Okay, and you can see default values in here. Anyway, we send in tiger, great, that's a tiger. But the important part here is our result. You can see this default value was added to our object. So it's safe to make the assumption that because we have a default value there, it's going to be present. We don't have to check for it. We can just go ahead and use it. Okay, so I talked a little bit about model mapping earlier. This is really powerful in that we can take input values and we can directly map it onto a model. And so that way you can just go ahead and use your model. In this case, we have a user UID. This is a user unique identifier. So anything that uniquely identifies a user, they can pass into your API. It's going to look up the data, and then it's going to pass back in this result the user model. Okay, so we can just go ahead and access the user's name or whatever we want at that point. Okay, so that's data normalization. And this provides a lot of reliability in your application. Like safe assumptions are a really, really cool thing, you know, and it helps clean up your code. It helps prevent a lot of these stupid bugs where you're just like, oh, I didn't have a null check there, or I thought this would be a string, but it's a number, all that stuff. Okay, so let's move. Oh, we gotta move fast. Okay, so Express, everyone uses it. It doesn't have any validation built in. Yay, okay. That bullet point doesn't have any purpose, okay. So anyway, you know what Express is, so let's look at how we use it with Joy, okay. So pretty much here, we're just declaring a route, and then we have a schema it validates against right away when it comes in, and we send it back. So, okay, it's pretty much the same thing with Tean, okay. Right when we get the parameters, we validate them and send it on. Okay, the problem with this is we're still relying on the developer to remember, or the maintainer, whoever, to update at this point. Or when they add a new route, we're relying on them to actually add the validation code in there. Okay, that's an issue, right? So let's talk about how we can use route middleware in Express to fix this. Okay, so Tean helps facilitate this a little bit, and it'll hook right into you, and it'll update your attach this parameter called safe data. Okay, so you know that's safe to use, you can go ahead and use that, okay? There's also one for Joy called Celebrate. You can check that out. Okay, and Hapi is a lot different than Express, okay? It's got a lot more stuff to it, okay? Lots of garbage in there, okay? Hapi's really cool. I actually like Hapi a lot. So let's look at how we declare a route in Hapi. So this looks pretty standard, right? Well, we just say it's a post, we give it a path, this handler just sends back, hey, great, that's great, whatever. Okay, but the cool part here is we can just attach this validate property until we want to validate the payload and what to validate in it. And from that point on, our data's safe. If somebody updates this route and adds another parameter to the payload, they have to update this or it'll fail. Okay, that's cool. Okay, so just a few takeaways that I hope we get from this, just high level, okay? Okay, we want to force data validation. Okay, if you have a system where it's like we don't want this to become docs, right? Nobody maintains docs. So we want to make sure that there is a mechanism in place that forces people to keep this up to date. Okay, we want to make sure the shape of our data is what we're expecting. And a powerful way I've found to make sure this happens is the rule, no validation, no data. That's how it works, okay? I don't care if you're in development mode, whatever. You don't validate the data, you don't get it. This forces the developer to update the data validation, make sure he or she is accepting what he wants while in development, okay? If you do this, you're going to know what's coming into your application. We're not going to have mystery values show up. Okay, and as far as normalization goes, we also want to make sure our data is all normalized. We know the shape of our data so we can make safe assumptions about it. So it's always going to have a consistent shape, and it's going to be reliable. We're going to get rid of all those stupid bugs, right? We're not going to have all these dumb gotchas and if null checks everywhere. One final thing is we've just talked about data coming into our API so far. But what about data leaving our API? Okay, have you thought about that? Okay, not a lot of people do. Okay, that's, I was supposed to do this, mind blown, but anyway. Okay, so that's pretty cool. So what this can do is prevent leaking information. So we've seen a lot of attacks where someone gets something bad into your database, and then the real damage is when it comes back out. They're either stealing information or they're sending information down to another client where it shouldn't be. But if we're validating this data on the way out, even if they're successful in the initial attack, it can't happen. So if you're sending back data you're not expecting to send back, you have malformed data. Something has gone wrong, and you shouldn't be returning that data anyway. So I have heartbleed up here in little quotes, right? So a heartbleed wasn't, that was something different. But we don't want to leak uninitialized memory or anything like that. If we're not expecting the shape of data we see on the way out, we shouldn't be handing it back. And this is also cool because it's a really easy way to see what your API is returning. You know, like what is this endpoint going to hand back? You don't have to like trace the code through or look up your models or anything like that. It's just going to be like, okay, here's my validation map. This is what it passes back. Okay, and that's cool for your client application as well because they have a reliable contract that they can depend on coming out of your API. Okay, so thanks. Yay.